Hello, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland. So this video is about the Iron Curtain speech because it's 75 years today since Winston Churchill delivered his Iron Curtain oration at Westminster College, Fulton, Missouri. So it was singularly apposite that the name of that college was Westminster, because the Palace of Westminster is the other name for the British Parliament, where Churchill spent so many distinguished years, well, from 1900 to 1964, with only one brief interruption. So what was the context of the situation? Well, it was only a few months since the end of the Second World War. Of course, the Japanese surrender came on the 15th of August 1945. And the month before that, July 1945, the United Kingdom had held a general election. Churchill was Prime Minister, leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party. He'd been in coalition with the Labour Party and the Liberal Party, and he'd suggested to them that, like after the First World War, there ought to be a post-war coalition to organise reconstruction. But they said no. They'd agreed to be in coalition until the defeat of the Third Reich. Germany surrendered in May, so they insisted on their election. They won their election, and Churchill was the centrepiece of the Conservative electoral campaign. And they couldn't believe it because obviously his stock was sky high. He was almost universally adulated within the United Kingdom, but nevertheless he went down to a defeat. People want a different vision. But perhaps I'm going off on a tangent too much. So Attlee was the Labour Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Now, as leader of the opposition, he could say things, Churchill could say things that Attlee couldn't, because it was a fact of life that the Soviet Union was a superpower, as it hadn't been before. The Soviets had come 500 miles further west as a result of the Second World War. They were in Berlin, even further west than Berlin, right in the heart of what was indubitably Western Europe. They were jointly occupying Austria, along with France, the United States, and the UK. They had several seemed to be satellite governments that were setting up. So the UK government still wanted to get along well with the Soviet Union. The Americans also believed they could have a cordial relationship with the Soviets in spite of the ideological gulf between them. And so obviously the Allies had been supplying the Soviets with weapons during the war. Now, this mustn't be exaggerated. Only about 5% of the weapons the Soviets used were from abroad. But this continued after the war, supplying trucks, not armaments, so far as I know. And Stalin asked a top British statesman, it was Sir Stafford Cripps, whether they could have access to some British aeronautical engineering. And to Stalin's astonishment, Cripps said yes, and they shared some civilian aviation, which presumably had a military application. So the Soviets, they were making the most of this fairly amicable relationship with the Occident. And Stalin really thought he was chancing it to ask this. So the United Kingdom and the Americans had really bent over backwards to accommodate the Soviets, to try to establish a cordial working relationship with after the war, because they simply had to accept that the Soviets were mighty. Moreover, there was a debt of honor to them, because of course the Soviets had borne the brunt of the Wehrmacht's assault. Easily 20 million Soviet citizens were killed in that war, about half civilians, about half military personnel. They suffered very, very badly indeed. I can't think who it was who said that the Red Army tore the guts out of the German army. That's quite true. And Western countries would not have had the courage, would not have had the spirit of self-sacrifice to suffer just so much. Western countries would rather have thrown the towel in than experience such untold agony. For example, when there was a VE Day parade in London at the end of the war, the Labour government wouldn't allow Polish troops to march in that for fear that the presence of the Poles would upset the Soviets. So Churchill was there to say things that Attlee dare not say, lest he offend Comrade Stalin. And one thing about Churchill is his relations with Roosevelt and then Truman were nothing like as cordial as the newsreels would have people believe. That camaraderie was just for public consumption, because it could only be unhelpful for the Allied cause if Americans and Britons knew that that their leaders sometimes disliked and distrusted each other. And of course, Attlee's relationship with Truman was not without its barbs either. So Churchill was something of a partisan figure. Obviously, some Labour leaders, Labour voters, they respected him as a war leader, but they might dislike him intensely on domestic policy. And remember some of the most controversial chapters from his long and storied career. To some, he was a dinosaur, and his wife Clementine thought he ought to have bowed out right at the end of the Second World War because his place in history was secured, rather than being someone who, as I say, was a partisan figure. He seemed to have fossilized notions of racial superiority, and his patrician manner played badly. But the Soviets and the Western countries had agreed to carve up Eastern Europe when they defeated Germany. And Churchill was part of this, the notorious percentages agreement, when on a piece of paper he and Stalin wrote down what percentage of influence the West and the Soviet Union would have in various countries, Poland, Romania, Greece, and so forth, after the war. Churchill was very keen to have Greece in the Western camp, partly out of reasons of Philhellenism. He had once been a Liberal MP, of course, and Greek independence was cause célèbre amongst Liberals, but also he recognises strategic importance. As a former First Lord of the Admiralty, he was keenly alive to that, but they were willing to sacrifice other Eastern European countries for the sake of retaining Hellas in the Western zone. That this naughty document Churchill thought should burn immediately, but Stalin told him he should keep it. I know it sickened many people in Poland and elsewhere to think that they were just traded away by it like Churchill, who had no right to do so. The Western countries were willing to recognise these Soviet illegal annexations of part of Finland, of all of Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Moldova, and some of Poland. So anyway, Churchill was leader of His Majesty's most loyal opposition when he went to that college, and there was meant to be democracy in all these Eastern European countries, but the Allies were already realising this was not happening. Even before the defeat of Germany, the Red Army had already attacked the Polish Home Army, the non-communist resistance movement, which had valorously fought against overwhelming odds against the Wehrmacht. And when they've been captured, they've been tortured, they've been killed, and then receiving similar treatment at the hands of the Red Army, and to add insult to injury, falsely accused of being Nazi collaborators. It was just so nauseatingly, grossly unjust. It showed just how foully evil the Soviet regime was. It was to its own people, it was to foreigners as well. And you can see why, when it came to a choice between the Third Reich and the Soviet Union, many people felt there was little to choose between them. Anyway, but Churchill's speech was actually meant to be entitled The Sinews of Peace. Could a peaceful world be built? The world was absolutely wrecked by all this war, and towards the end of the Second World War, the UK had even considered were they going to have to fight on against the Soviet Union on their own. It was called Operation Unthinkable, and the British summary was quite impossible. There was no way on earth the British Empire, which still exists then, could defeat the Soviet Union, which had a much greater industrial capacity. So Churchill realised that the Soviets were stealthily setting up one-party states by salami tactics, by clamping down on one party after another, after banning them, and they were cunning enough to only do it bit by bit, accusing them of being fascist, promoting this Stalinist big lie that there are only two positions: you're either a communist or a fascist, so there's no middle ground. A liberal, a social democrat, or a conservative is just a fascist in disguise. And taking over key ministries. There were often coalition governments. The communists make sure they got the police, and then obviously muzzling the press, and just like the Russian government does today, spreading disinformation, calumniating those who love freedom. So, as Churchill said, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has fallen across Europe, and behind it lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. So Stettin is Szczecin in Poland these days. Trieste was ambiguous. Should be part of Yugoslavia, should be part of Italy. That wasn't finally settled to 1975. So Yugoslavia was initially a Soviet ally, but as of 1949, when Josip Broz Tito, their president, chose to accept Marshall aid, the Yugoslavs ploughed their own furrow, much to Stalin's chagrin. So this expression, the Iron Curtain, goes back to the 1890s. A British novelist coined it, but actually the Third Reich had used it in some of their propaganda newsreels. And despite this unfortunate coincidence, there's nothing wrong with using it in relation to the Soviet Union. That's quite true, and to its satrapies, because obviously they were closing the border and they were not allowing the free press in and not allowing people to vote with their feet and leave. So the Cold War hadn't quite begun. It wasn't obvious just how bad it was going to be. And, not everybody wanted to accept Churchill's prognostications. They wanted to believe there were going to be free and fair elections. So the Soviets were doing it stealthily. But within 3 years of this speech, really every Eastern and Central European country was a one-party state. But Churchill would have preferred détente. He wanted to avoid Cold War. He'd been partly responsible for starting the First World War and the Second World War, even if he fought in righteous causes. There are many people in his country in both cases who believe these wars could have been avoided or could have been ended sooner.